The wind, a howling wolf, across the frozen Volga, carried not just the scent of snow and ice, but the metallic temps of blood and the acrid smoke of endless battle. It was late autumn, 1942, and Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a wound, festering on the vast, indifferent steppe. Here, in this crucible of concrete and human will, the Sixth Army, the spearhead of the very embodiment of the Blitzkrieg's unstoppable might, was being slowly, painstakingly consumed. From the frostbitten fingers clutching a carabiner to the weary eyes scanning a shattered horizon, every German soldier knew, deep in the marrow of their bones, that this was different. This wasn't the swift, triumphant march across France, nor the relentless push through the dusty fields of Ukraine. This was a war of brick against flesh, of ice against iron, a grinding, brutal calculus of attrition that defied every tenet of Prussian military doctrine. General Friedrich Paulus, a man whose meticulousness had once earned him accolades, now found his precision lost in a vortex of chaos. His headquarters, a damp cellar beneath a ruined department store, offered little refuge from the incessant shelling that hammered the city above. The map, spread across a makeshift table, showed not lines of advance, but shrinking pockets of resistance, isolated islands in an encroaching red tide. Each pin, each red arrow representing Soviet divisions, felt like a spike driven into the heart of his command. He stared at the numbers, the dwindling supply figures, the mounting casualty reports, and the truth began to emerge, stark and unforgiving. The Sixth Army, once an instrument of absolute power, was becoming a sacrifice. But to whom and for what? The orders from above, from the Führer himself, remained unwavering. Hold at all costs, no retreat. A phrase that, in the icy grip of Stalingrad, transmuted from an order into a death sentence. The decision, when it finally arrived, was not a single, dramatic moment of pronouncement, but a slow, agonizing creep of inevitability. It began with a whisper of the Kalmyk steppes, a sound carried on the frozen wind, speaking of vast, unyielding distances. It spoke of the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, a two-pronged hammer blow that struck the vulnerable Romanian and Hungarian flanks, guarding the Sixth Army's rear. Paulus received the reports, first with disbelief, then with a dawning horror. The Romanians, ill-equipped and demoralized, shattered like glass. The Hungarians, valiant but outmatched, simply vanished into the blizzard. The lines, once distant, now converged behind them, sealing off the entire army. The ring was closed. 25,000 square kilometers of frozen hell, and within it, 300,000 men. Trapped, the air in Paulus's bunker grew colder, heavier than the winter outside. The radio crackled with desperate pleas for air support that never came, for supplies that dwindled to nothing but promises. He could hear the distant, guttural roar of Soviet tanks, not just in front, but now behind, an omnipresent threat that gnawed at the sanity of his staff. His subordinate, General Arthur Schmidt, ever the pragmatist, spoke of the necessity of a breakout, of fighting their way west, but the Führer's voice, transmitted across hundreds of miles of crackling wire, was absolute. The Sixth Army will hold. It was a command that ignored terrain, weather, and the very laws of physics. It was a command born of delusion, and in its cold, unyielding finality, it broke not just the morale of the men, but the tactical mind of the general himself. The decision to remain, to transform an army into a static fortress, was not Paulus's alone, but it was his burden to bear. He, the meticulous planner, became the unwilling executor of a grand, suicidal histoire. Above the snow-covered ruins, the Luftwaffe attempted desperate, often futile, supply drops. Each Junker's Ru-52, a lumbering target against the unforgiving sky, became a symbol of a promise that could not be kept. The men below, starving, freezing, saw the planes as fleeting birds of hope, only to watch them often crash, laden with insufficient supplies, or be shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. A single daily ration for a German soldier became a piece of bread and a spoonful of horse meat, if they were lucky. Diseases spread like wildfire through the cramped bunkers and improvised hospitals. Frostbite claimed limbs, then lives. The fighting continued, house by house, floor by floor, a macabre dance of death amongst the ruble. But the true enemy was not just the Soviet soldier. It was the gnawing cold, the relentless hunger, and the creeping despair that whispered of abandonment. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. Christmas came and went, a ghost of celebrations past, marked only by the dwindling fuel for heaters and the hollow stares of men who had seen too much. Paulus, once a figure of authority, became a prisoner of his own command. His eyes haunted by the ghost of a military career, slowly turning into a monumental failure. He walked through his subterranean headquarters, a mausoleum of lost hopes, and saw his officers, their faces pale and drawn, their uniforms stained with the grime of siege. They discussed trivial matters of logistics, of troop movements that were increasingly meaningless. While the rumble of Soviet artillery drew ever closer, a constant reminder of the tightening noose, the grand strategy had collapsed, replaced by a desperate struggle for mere survival. The decision to stay, enforced from afar, had transformed a proud army into a doomed garrison. The Soviet offensive continued its relentless grind. General Chukhov's 62nd Army, once battered and almost broken, found new strength, fueled by a ferocious desire for revenge and the knowledge that the Germans were starving. The close-quarter fighting in the ruined factories and apartment blocks became even more brutal. Hand-to-hand combat, bayonets, trench-nebus, every weapon was used in the fight for inches of scorched earth. The psychological toll on both sides was immense, but for the encircled Germans, it was compounded by the crushing realization that no relief was coming. Their hope was a mirage, shimmering in the desolate expanse of the steppes. The Führer's promise of a breakout of Field Marshal Manstein's planned rescue Operation Winterguitter became a cruel joke. The distance was too vast, the weather too severe, and the Soviet resistance too strong. The decision to hold meant sacrificing an entire army for a patch of ruins that held no strategic value, only symbolic weight for a dictator consumed by ego. The end was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. Ammunition ran low. The last tanks ran out of fuel. Radios crackled with increasingly desperate, then utterly silent pleas. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a final, cynical gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was a veiled command to fight to the death or commit suicide. Paulus, however, made his final, most human decision. The next day, January 31st, 1943, he defied Hitler. He ordered the surrender of the southern pocket of his army. It was not a grand tactical victory, but an act of mercy, a final recognition that even the most feared army had its breaking point, and that human lives, in the face of absolute futility, held more value than a dictator's delusion. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days, but the spirit of resistance was broken. The once mighty 6th Army, over 300,000 strong, was reduced to less than 90,000 starving, frostbitten prisoners, marching into a Soviet captivity from which few would ever return. The silence that finally fell over Stalingrad was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, echoing quiet of utter devastation. The city, a graveyard of concrete and twisted metal, lay under a blanket of fresh snow, covering the scars of unimaginable brutality. The decision to break, though made by a general in a bunker, was felt by every soldier, every citizen, every family back in Germany who awaited news that would never come. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, turning the tide of the war and engraving itself into the annals of history as the place where the tide turned, not just on a battlefield, but in the heart of an empire. The true cost of absolute power and blind obedience was laid bare, frozen in the ruins of Stalingrad, a stark warning etched forever in the icy grip of that brutal Russian winter. If this journey into the brutal heart of Stalingrad has moved you, consider joining our ranks. History is not just about the past. It is a warning for the future. Subscribe to our channel to uncover the secrets they tried to bury, and leave a comment below. What do you believe was the real breaking point for the Sixth Army? Your support allows us to keep these stories alive until the next archive is opened.